The moment Georgia Harper stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1881, she knew with absolute certainty that her old life was behind her, and that whatever waited ahead of her in this sun-scorched, wind-bitten town was going to be either the making of her or the end of her entirely. She stood on the unpainted boardwalk with a single leather trunk at her feet and a hatbox balanced in the crook of her arm, and she watched the dusty main street of Caldwell stretch out before her like a long brown scar across the earth. Men on horseback moved up and down the road. A group of cowboys leaned against the wall of a saloon, their boots crossed at the ankle, their hats pulled low against the afternoon glare. A woman in a faded calico dress swept the porch of the general store without looking up. The wind picked up the edge of Georgia's skirt, and she pressed it down with her free hand and told herself she was not afraid. She was 24 years old, recently widowed, and she had come to Caldwell because it was the farthest place from Charleston, South Carolina, that she could afford to reach on what little money her late husband had left her. That was not much of a reason to choose a place. She understood that. But she had learned in the last 3 years that reasons were often poor guides, and that you sometimes had to just pick a direction and walk. Georgia Harper had been married at 21 to a man named Thomas Aldrich, who was pleasant enough in the way that certain pieces of furniture are pleasant enough. He did not raise his voice. He did not drink excessively. He provided a house and food and the general structure of a life. But he had also been 20 years her senior, arranged by her father, and so deeply uninterested in the actual person that Georgia was that she had begun to feel, in the slow passage of those 3 years, that she was dissolving from the inside out. Thomas had died of a fever in November of 1880, and while Georgia had mourned him in the way you mourn a familiar routine, she had also felt, buried beneath the grief, something that shamed her to acknowledge. She had felt relief. She had felt a door swinging open. Her father had written immediately with the name of another suitable man. Georgia had written back that she intended to find her own life, and then she had packed the leather trunk and the hat box, and she had gotten on a train heading west. She breathed in the Kansas air now, which smelled of horse and dust, and something faintly sweet that she could not name, and she picked up her trunk by the handle and walked toward the only boarding house she could see, a 2-story white building with green shutters, and a sign above the door that read Dalton's ROOMS. The woman who ran Dalton's rooms was named Marta Swenson, a broad-shouldered Swedish immigrant of about 50 with iron-gray hair and a laugh that seemed to start somewhere deep in her chest and work its way up. She looked Georgia over from hat to hem, not unkindly, and told her a room would cost 50 cents a week, and that supper was at 6, and that she did not allow men above the first-floor landing after dark. Georgia said that suited her perfectly. She was shown to a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced west, so that the sunset came pouring through every evening in long orange sheets that lit the whitewashed walls like something from a painting. There was a narrow bed with a quilt in a log cabin pattern, a washstand with a blue ceramic basin, and a small writing desk beneath the window. It was austere and clean, and it felt, in a way that Georgia could not entirely explain, more like home than the beautifully furnished bedroom in Charleston had ever felt. She unpacked her trunk that evening, shook out her dresses and hung them on the pegs behind the door, set her small framed photograph of her mother on the writing desk, and sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around at the quiet room and let herself feel the full strangeness of where she was and what she was doing. She had no clear plan beyond not going back. She had perhaps $20 remaining after the stages and trains. She would need work. She was educated, having attended a school for young women in Charleston until she was 18, and she could read and write with fluency. She could cipher numbers well. She could sew, and she could cook, and she had, over the years of running Thomas's household, become quite capable with bookkeeping. She hoped that somewhere in Caldwell, Kansas, there was someone who needed one or several of those things. The next morning she put on her second-best dress, a dark blue wool with white cuffs that suggested competence without trying too hard to suggest wealth, and she walked the length of Caldwell's Main Street, which was called Kisham Avenue, and looked for any sign of opportunity. The general store was owned by a man named Grady who shook his head apologetically and said his wife managed the accounts. The hotel had a sign-on boy who handled the desk. The land office had no use for additional staff. Georgia was beginning to feel the particular heaviness of a plan that has no plan when she paused outside a modest wooden building set back slightly from the street. The painted sign above the door read ROURKE Land and Cattle Brokerage, and below that, in smaller letters, established 1877. Through the front window she could see a cluttered office, stacks of papers on every surface, a filing cabinet with one drawer hanging open, a large map of the Kansas Territory tacked to the far wall with so many pins in it that it resembled a pincushion, and behind a broad oak desk that was barely visible beneath the avalanche of correspondence and ledger books, a man sat writing with the focused intensity of someone who had forgotten that the world outside his window existed. Georgia stood on the boardwalk for a moment, watching through the glass. She was very good at reading situations quickly, and what she read in that office was a capable man drowning in disorganization. She had spent 3 years managing Thomas's considerable household accounts and correspondence, and she had learned from his bookkeeper, old Mr. Fredericks, the particular logic of debentry accounting. She could look at a ledger and find an error in under 5 minutes. She had a gift for it. She pushed open the door. The bell above it announced her, and the man looked up from his writing, and Georgia Harper got her first proper look at Edgar Rourke. He was perhaps 30 or so, she guessed. Lean and long-limbed, with the kind of build that came from years of physical work rather than intention. His hair was dark brown, slightly too long, as though a haircut was perpetually on his list of things to get around to. His eyes were an unusual color, a sort of pale amber brown that the afternoon light caught and made almost gold. He had a strong jaw shadowed with several days of dark stubble, a straight nose slightly off-center as though it had been broken once and healed imperfectly, and an expression when he looked up that suggested he was still partly in whatever thought he had been in when the door opened. He wore a plain collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that he had apparently forgotten to remove indoors. There was ink on 2 of his fingers. He was, Georgia observed with the detachment of a woman who was here on business, quite strikingly handsome. "Can I help you?" he said, and his voice was low and even, with a cadence that she later learned was part Texas, part Missouri, shaped by years of moving. "I hope so," Georgia said, stepping fully inside and closing the door behind her. "My name is Georgia Harper. I have recently arrived in Caldwell and I am looking for employment. I noticed your office as I passed, and I will say directly that from the condition of it, you appear to be in considerable need of someone who can manage correspondence and accounts. I am that person if you are interested." He blinked. He had clearly expected her to be asking about land or cattle. "I'm not advertising a position," he said. "No," Georgia agreed pleasantly. "But you need one nonetheless. How long has that filing cabinet been open? I can see from here that those papers have been stacked in it rather than filed. What you have is not a system, Mr. Rourke, it's a pile." Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. He glanced at the filing cabinet. 3 weeks, he said, maybe 4. And that stack of correspondence on the left side of your desk, those are unanswered letters, are they not? I can see the envelopes beneath them. He looked at the stack. He rubbed the back of his neck with the hand that had the ink on it. "I've been riding out to the Thompson Ranch all week. The filing got away from me. Mr. Rourke," Georgia said, because she had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, "I am asking you to let me demonstrate what I can do. Give me 1 hour with whatever is most pressing in this room, and then tell me it was not useful. I charge 50 cents a day to start. If after a week you don't find my work satisfactory, You pay me nothing beyond what the week cost you, and I will go and trouble you no further." He looked at her steadily for a moment. She held his gaze without flinching, because she had learned that flinching was the fastest way to lose a negotiation, and also because his eyes were genuinely interesting up close, a kind of warm amber that reminded her of very old honey. "All right," he said at last. "1 hour." She set her small bag on the side table, took off her gloves, and went to the filing cabinet. That 1 hour turned into 4. The pile of unanswered correspondence alone took 90 minutes because several of the letters required immediate response, and Georgia drafted 2 of them in a crisp and precise hand and set them on the desk in front of Edgar Rourke and asked if they reflected his intentions. He read them, looked up at her once, and said they did. She went back to the filing cabinet. By the time the sun had shifted and the office was full of long golden shadows, she had organized the filing cabinet into a logical, alphabetical, and day-ordered system, drafted a response to a buyer in Dodge City who had been waiting 3 weeks for an answer, and created a simple but functional ledger index that cross-referenced the loose receipts piled in the bottom drawer of the cabinet. Edgar Rourke sat back in his chair and looked at the cleared portion of his desk as though he was seeing the surface of it for the first time in months, which might well have been the case. "You're hired," he said. $1 a day. You're worth more than 50 cents. Georgia allowed herself one small smile. "I start tomorrow morning at 8. 7, he said. "I'm usually here by 6, but I'll give you until 7. She picked up her gloves. 7, she agreed, and walked out into the late afternoon sunlight, feeling for the first time in a very long time that she was precisely where she was supposed to be. The weeks that followed were, for Georgia, a kind of revelation. She had always been capable, but had spent years in Charleston performing only a fraction of what she could actually do, contained by the expectations of what a proper young wife was meant to occupy herself with. In Edgar Rourke's office, she had room to move. The business of land and cattle brokerage was complex and fast-moving. Edgar negotiated land deals for ranchers buying and selling acreage across the Kansas territory, arranged sales of cattle stock between ranchers and buyers as far as Abilene and Wichita, and managed contracts for several smaller outfits who kept him on retainer to handle their legal correspondence. It was a great deal of work, and he had been doing all of it himself with the assistance of one man, a young cowhand named Percy, who ran messages and occasionally helped with the horses, but had no head for paperwork whatsoever. Percy was 19, tall and gangly, with a good-natured face and an admiration for Georgia that expressed itself in a shy helpfulness that she found genuinely touching. Georgia organized Edgar's correspondence into a daily schedule. She set up a proper double entry accounting ledger for the brokerage accounts. She drafted contracts and letters with the kind of precision that Edgar told her, with a bluntness that she had already come to appreciate, was better than anything he had managed himself. She found 2 billing errors that had cost the business nearly $40 and corrected them. She learned the names of every rancher and buyer Edgar dealt with, learned the particulars of each ongoing negotiation, and was soon as conversant in the business of the brokerage as he was. What she was learning about Edgar Rourke, in the way you learn a person when you work closely beside them every day, was equally interesting. He was not a complicated man in the sense of being secretive or layered with hidden intentions, but he was a deep man, which was different. He thought carefully before he spoke. He was genuinely fair in his dealings with people, even when fairness cost him something. He was patient with Percy's mistakes in a way that spoke well of him, correcting without humiliating. He was, she discovered, funny in a dry and understated way that crept up on you. He would say something so flat-toned and straight-faced that you were halfway to a reply before the humor landed, and then the grin came, slow and crooked and completely unself-conscious. He had come to Kansas from Texas by way of Missouri, as she had guessed from his voice. He had grown up on his father's cattle ranch outside San Antonio, the middle of 3 brothers, and had ridden the Kishom Trail twice in his early 20s, once as a regular cowhand and once as a trail boss. He had built the brokerage from nothing in 1877 with $100 and the contacts he had made on the trail, and had grown it steadily in the 4 years since. He was not married. He had never been married. He lived in a small house behind the office that Percy's mother, a stout and warm woman named Delia, kept clean in exchange for a small regular payment. He ate most of his suppers at the hotel dining room or at the cattle ranchers' tables when he was out riding the range, and he slept 6 hours a night as a rule, and was at his desk by 6 in the morning regardless of what had happened the night before. Georgia learned all of this the way you learn a place you are beginning to belong to, gradually, through accumulated detail. She did not set out to fall in love with Edgar Rourke. She was, in fact, quite determined not to fall in love with anyone for a good long while. She had only just got her life into her own hands. She was not about to hand it to someone else immediately. But there was a morning in early June when something shifted. They had been working late the evening before on a complex land transaction involving a rancher named Beaumont whose deed title was being contested by a neighboring family, and they had both come in early, arriving within minutes of each other. And Edgar had appeared at the office door with 2 tin cups of coffee from the hotel, and set one on her desk without being asked, without comment, as naturally as if he had always done this, and she had looked up from the deed map she was studying and said thank you. And he had sat down and opened his ledger and begun reading without looking at her, and there had been such easy and comfortable quiet between them that Georgia had felt it in her chest. Like warmth. She looked at him across the office, bent over his ledger, a line between his brows as he read, one hand resting on the desk, and she understood with the calm clarity of something true that she was in considerable trouble. She did not say anything to him. She put her head down and looked at the deed map, but the warmth in her chest did not go away, and she stopped pretending to herself that it would. Edgar, for his part, was also not intending to fall in love with Georgia Harper. He told himself this with some regularity throughout the months of May and June, and into the long golden summer of 1881. He was 31 years old, and he had kept himself systematically unattached for reasons that had to do with the nature of his work, which required constant movement, and with a previous experience of heartbreak that he did not particularly care to revisit, and with a general sense that the emotional complexity of a serious romantic attachment was something that could be safely deferred indefinitely. He told himself these things, and then he found himself thinking about the way Georgia moved through the office, direct and precise, like someone who knew exactly what each next step was. He thought about the way she argued with him, which was directly and without apology, bringing her points in clear logical order and refusing to be dismissed, and which he found not aggravating but genuinely exhilarating. He thought about the look on her face when she found an error in a document, a quick, bright satisfaction that she did not quite bother to suppress. He thought about the way she had looked on the afternoon she had read a letter from one of the smaller ranchers who was losing his land to foreclosure, how the professional composure had softened for just a moment into something that was unmistakably compassion, and how she had set the letter down and looked at him and said quietly, "Is there anything we can do for him?" He had gone and spoken to the bank on that rancher's behalf and renegotiated the terms, which he had not necessarily planned to do. But Georgia had asked, and so he had done it. He was aware this was relevant information. What stopped him from saying anything was not indifference. It was precisely the opposite. Georgia Harper was not the kind of woman you approached with a casual word and a vague suggestion. She was too clear-sighted for that. If he spoke, he would have to mean it fully, and meaning things fully was, he admitted to himself, not something he had permitted himself to do in a long time. The summer moved on. They worked together every day, and the rhythm of it became as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, and he suspected this was true for her too, from the easy way she anticipated what he needed before he asked for it, the way she finished his sentences when they were working through a complex problem, the way she looked up from her desk sometimes, and caught him already looking at her, and neither of them looked away immediately. Caldwell in the summer of 1881 was a lively town. It sat at the southern end of the Kisham Trail, which meant that from late spring through autumn it received a steady flow of cattle drives pushing north from Texas toward the Kansas railheads. And with the cattle came the cowboys. And with the cowboys came the particular kind of energy that congregated around the saloons and the livery and the wide, dusty streets at all hours of the day and evening. It was not a lawless town exactly, but it was a town that required its law to be present and alert. And the marshal, a capable veteran of the frontier named Jim Cable, rode his rounds with the precise regularity of a man who understood that regularity was itself a form of authority. Georgia was not frightened by any of this. She had the sense, which she had developed quickly, of how to navigate it, which streets to take at which hours, which men tipped their hats and meant it pleasantly, and which were performing pleasantness over something else. She had walked home from the office on summer evenings more times than she could count, and had managed every situation she encountered with the combination of directness and composure that seemed to be her most reliable tools. It was on one such evening in late July that she encountered an exception. She had stayed late to finish the ledger reconciliation for the month, and the sun was going down as she locked the office and started the 6-minute walk back to Marta's boarding house. She was passing the narrow alley between the hardware store and the feed merchant when a man stepped out into her path. She knew him by sight. His name was Cass Dalton, no relation to Marta despite the shared name, a man of perhaps 35 who ran a small outfit south of town, and who had a reputation for being unpleasant when he was drinking, which he apparently was now. He had been in the office twice in the past month attempting to engage Edgar in a land deal that Edgar had declined, and both times Georgia had observed that Cass Dalton was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through persistence, and a particular kind of low-level intimidation that never quite crossed into a line that could be named. He was crossing that line now. "You're Harper's girl," he said, blocking her path. "Working for Rourke." "I am employed by Mr. Rourke, yes," Georgia said evenly, shifting her bag to her other arm. "Good evening, Mr. Dalton." She moved to step around him, and he moved to block her again, and there was a look in his eyes that she did not like, the flat, assessing look of a man calculating what he could get away with. "I've got a land proposal for Rourke," he said. "Maybe you put in a word for me." "Mr. Rourke's schedule is managed through the office," Georgia said, keeping her voice even and her chin level. "You're welcome to call in tomorrow morning. Maybe I want to discuss it tonight." She was about to respond when she heard footsteps on the boardwalk, and then Edgar Rourke was there, appearing from the direction of the hotel where he had apparently been for a late supper, and he took in the scene with the swift economy of a man who had grown up around cattle country and knew an uncomfortable situation when he saw one. "Dalton," he said, stepping up beside Georgia with the natural ease of someone who simply knew where he was supposed to be. His voice was perfectly conversational, no particular edge in it. "I thought I saw you coming out of the Silver Star earlier. You heading home?" Cass Dalton looked at Edgar for a moment, looked at Georgia, recalculated, and stepped back off the line he had been edging across. "Just saying good evening," he said. Edgar said agreeably. "Night, Cass," Dalton went. Edgar turned to Georgia, and she saw the concern in his face that his voice had not let out. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. "Perfectly well," she said, which was mostly true. Her heart was going a little faster than she would have liked. "Thank you." "I'll walk you back," he said, and it was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. They walked the remaining blocks to Marta's boarding house side by side in the warm summer dark, and he was close enough that their arms brushed twice on the uneven boardwalk, and neither of them moved away from it. At the foot of the steps up to the boarding house porch, Georgia stopped and turned to him. "Thank you," she said again, and meant it more than the first time. He looked at her in the thin light from Marta's porch lantern, and she could see the amber in his eyes even in the near dark, and something was happening in the air between them that was very clear to both of them. She was certain of that. "Georgia," he said, and then he stopped, and she had the impression of a man who had come to the edge of something and was deciding whether to step. She waited. He reached up and took off his hat, which she had come to notice was his tell when he was uncertain, an involuntary gesture he made when something had reached through the composed exterior to the human person underneath. He held it at his side and looked at her. "I don't know how to say this in a manner that doesn't sound." He paused. "You know how I am with words when they're not on paper." She did know. On paper he was precise and clear and exactly right. In conversation he was less certain, more likely to trail off and reach for something which she found, in contradiction of all logic, entirely endearing. "Say it however it comes out," she said softly. "I find myself thinking about you," he said, "considerably, more than is professionally appropriate." He was watching her face. "I thought you should know that." Georgia stood in the lantern light and felt something in her chest, warm and certain and alive. "I think you should know," she said carefully, "that I find myself thinking about you considerably as well." The slow, crooked grin came, the one that started on one side and took a moment to reach the other. She had been watching it for 4 months, and it still did something to her that she could not entirely account for. "Well," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I would like to take you to supper," he said, "at the hotel, Friday evening if you're willing." "I am," she said. "Good night, Edgar. Good night, Georgia." She went up the steps and into the boarding house and stood in the front hall for a moment, listening to her own breathing and feeling the smile on her face, and permitting herself, entirely without shame, to enjoy every bit of it. Friday's supper was the beginning of something that unfolded through the rest of August with the slow and beautiful inevitability of a season changing. They had supper at the hotel, which was a proper sit-down establishment with white tablecloths and candles, and a menu written on a small chalkboard. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about everything they had not talked about in the office, about the things that had made them, and the things they wanted, and the particular texture of their individual histories. Edgar told her about growing up in Texas, about the cattle drives, about building the brokerage from one rented room with a handshake and a good memory for names. He told her about his father, who had been a tough and fair man, and his mother, who had died when Edgar was 12. He told her about his older brother Matthew, who had the ranch now, and his younger brother Eli, who was somewhere in New Mexico territory working for a mining outfit. Georgia told him about Charleston, about her father's house with its formal rooms and its expectations, about the school and the books she had loved, about the feeling of being educated and capable, and then placed in a life that had no use for most of what she was. She told him about Thomas, not with bitterness but honestly, and he listened without interrupting, which she appreciated deeply. She did not tell him the part about feeling relief at Thomas's death, but she thought perhaps he understood it anyway, from the way his eyes moved over her face when she described the years of that marriage, a quiet and perceptive reading that suggested he saw what was between the words she was using. "You deserved better than that," he said very simply, and she had to look away for a moment to collect herself, because she had not, she realized, ever heard those words said to her about that specific thing, and they hit unexpectedly hard. He reached across the table and his hand covered hers briefly, just a moment, and then he moved it back. She felt the warmth of it for the rest of the evening. They began spending their Sunday afternoons together, riding out into the country east of Caldwell, where the prairie rolled out flat and golden, and the sky was enormous, and the world felt uncrowded in the way that Georgia, who had spent her life in the close social geometry of Charleston drawing rooms, found almost intoxicating. Edgar kept 2 horses at the livery, his own bay gelding, Storm, and a gentler buckskin he said she was welcome to use, and Georgia had learned to ride as a girl and took to the buckskin immediately, and was competent enough in the saddle that he did not coddle her with slow paces, and she appreciated that too. On those Sunday rides they talked and were also comfortable with silence, which was a thing Georgia had learned to take seriously as an indicator of how well you truly fit with a person. Silence with Thomas had always been slightly anxious on her side, the silence of someone wondering if they were failing to provide sufficient entertainment. Silence with Edgar was simply quiet, shared and easy, two people present in the same world. There was an afternoon in late August, the heat thick and the grass on the prairie gone golden, when they dismounted at a creek and let the horses drink. And they sat on the bank, and Edgar was talking about a transaction he was working on, a large parcel of land being sold by an aging rancher named Whitfield to a buyer from St. Louis. And Georgia was listening and watching the light on the water, and she turned her face to say something, and found that he had gone quiet and was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something entirely unguarded, something that made her breath stop in her chest. "What is it?" she said softly. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair back behind her ear, and his fingers rested for a moment against her cheek, and she stayed perfectly still. "Georgia Harper," he said, "you have complicated my life considerably." "Have I?" she managed. "Irreversibly, I think," he said, and there was wonder in it, genuine wonder, as if the fact of loving her was something that had arrived from outside him and remade him in the course of arriving. She turned her face further toward him, and he kissed her, finally, with the prairie around them and the creek moving over the rocks and the horses standing patient in the sun. And it was a gentle, careful, entirely deliberate kiss. And she kissed him back with her whole entire heart, and let go, at last, of every careful reservation she had been holding. They rode back to Caldwell in the long late afternoon light with their horses close beside each other, and their knuckles brushing when they passed near enough. And Georgia thought about the word irreversibly, and how it was exactly right. September came, and the cattle drives were tapering off as the season turned toward autumn, and Caldwell was finding its quieter rhythm. The brokerage was busy with end-of-season settlements and land transactions that the activity of summer had generated, and Georgia and Edgar worked long hours and supped together most evenings, and spent the Sunday afternoons riding out on the prairie. And the whole shape of Georgia's life had become something so different from what it had been a year ago in Charleston that she sometimes stopped in the middle of an ordinary moment, walking across the office, or braiding her hair in the morning in Marta's small mirror, and felt the difference of it in her whole body. She had also, in the months since her arrival, begun to be known in Caldwell, to be a part of its fabric in the small but real ways that matter. Marta had become a genuine friend, a woman whose frank and warm intelligence Georgia found enormously restorative after years of the careful social performance of Charleston. Percy had become something like a younger brother, and she had taken it upon herself to begin teaching him to read and cipher properly on slow afternoons in the office, because he had told her once, with the careful offhandedness of someone embarrassed by a lack, that he had not had much schooling, and she had said briskly that this was entirely correctable, and produced a primer from Grady's general store the following morning. Percy's progress was genuine, and he was proud of it in a way that made Georgia happy in a simple and complete way. She had also become acquainted with several of the women in town, among them the doctor's wife, a sharp and interesting woman named Clara Hatch, and the school teacher, a young woman named Ellen Price, who had come to Caldwell the same year as Georgia, and with whom she shared the common ground of two educated women making their way in a place that had not quite accounted for them. The three of them took to meeting on Thursday evenings at Clara's house over tea and lively conversation that ranged from literature to local politics to the shared observations of frontier life. It was Clara in her direct medical manner who said to Georgia one Thursday in September, with the tea still steaming and Ellen Price nodding beside her, "You love that man, don't you?" Georgia looked up from her cup. "Edgar Rourke," Clara said. "Don't look at me like that, the whole town can see it." Georgia felt the color in her cheeks. She looked down at her tea and then back up. "Yes," she said, "I believe I do." Ellen pressed her hands together in a small gesture of delight. Clara smiled. And he, Clara said. I believe so, Georgia said, and the warmth in her chest was so overwhelming that she laughed softly despite herself, which was its own kind of answer. She was thinking about all of this on the morning in early October when Edgar came into the office wearing an expression she had not seen on him before, something complicated and effortful, and she looked up from the letter she was writing and said, "What is it?" He sat down in the chair across from her desk, which was not where he usually sat, and he put his hat on his knee and turned it once in his hands. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "There's a property situation that needs handling," he said, "out near the Cimarron River. It's going to take me the better part of 2 weeks to ride out and negotiate it properly. Whitfield's land sale, the one I was telling you about. The buyer from St. Louis wants me there in person for the survey and the signing, and the survey has to be done before the ground freezes." He paused. "I'll need to leave Friday." "I know," she said. She did know she had helped him prepare the file for it. "I'll manage the office. Percy and I can handle what comes up, and I'll send a rider if anything urgent comes in." He was quiet for a moment. He turned the hat again. Then he looked at her directly. "I don't want to leave," he said. She felt the full weight of what he was not saying. She set down her pen. "Edgar," she said carefully, "you own a business. You need to go." "I know I need to go," he said. "I know that." He paused and then said, with the quiet concentration of a man being extremely honest, "This is the first time in a long time that the thought of leaving somewhere has felt like a genuine loss." She looked at him across the desk in the autumn morning light, and felt everything in her drawn toward him with a gravity that had nothing tentative left in it. "Then come back quickly," she said softly. He stood up. He looked at her for a moment, and then he came around the desk and took her face in both his hands, carefully, as though she was something he intended to keep, and kissed her with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity about any of it. When he stepped back, his eyes were very bright and a little unsteady. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He was gone by Friday, riding out with his gear and a pack horse and a copy of the Whitfield file in his saddlebag, and Georgia stood at the front window of the office and watched him ride south out of Caldwell until he was small in the distance and then gone, and then she sat down at her desk and went back to work. The 2 weeks without him were not bad, precisely. The work kept her occupied, and the company of Marta and Clara and Ellen sustained her evenings, and Percy was a reliable and increasingly competent presence in the office. But the days had a different texture without him, a quietness that was not the comfortable kind. She caught herself turning to speak to him and finding the empty chair, and the lack of it was a small but genuine ache that told her something she already knew. He had been gone 11 days when the situation with Cass Dalton became more serious. She had known since the encounter in the alley in July that Dalton resented Edgar's refusal of his land proposal. He had come into the office twice since then, and Georgia had managed him professionally and distantly, and he had gone each time frustrated, which was the best outcome available. But on the 11th day of Edgar's absence, Dalton came into the office in the morning with 2 of his ranch hands behind him and a manner that was not distant or merely unpleasant. It was aimed. He wanted the Whitfield land files. He claimed that there was a competing offer for the Whitfield parcel, a prior claim, and that he had a right to see the file documentation. He did not have a right to see it. Georgia knew that clearly. Those files were Edgar's private business documents. She told him so, calmly and without apology. "Rourke's not here," Dalton said, leaning his hands on the front of her desk. "I'll look at the file and be gone. Mr. Rourke will be back within the week," Georgia said, keeping her eyes level. "If you have a claim to present, you may present it to him at that time. Until then, I am not in a position to share client documentation." Dalton looked at her with the flat, calculating expression she had seen in the alley, and she kept her hands still on the desk and her face composed and held the line. He went finally, muttering something she did not catch. After the door closed behind him, she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, very still, and then she called Percy in and told him she would need him in the office for the rest of the day, not riding errands. That evening she sent a letter to Edgar at the hotel in Clearwater, where she knew he would be stopping on his return route, describing the encounter in full. She told him to return at his earliest convenience. She was not prone to alarm, but she trusted her instincts about Dalton, and her instincts said this was not finished. She was right. 2 days later, on a Wednesday morning, she arrived at the office to find that the lock on the back door had been forced. The back room, where Edgar kept his safe and the original deed copies, had been entered. The safe itself was untouched, which suggested either that whoever had come did not know the combination or had been looking for something else. She went through the filing cabinet and her desk and the shelves with methodical care. The Whitfield file was missing. She stood in the middle of the office in the morning light and took a careful breath and thought about what to do. She went directly to Marshal Cable. Jim Cable was a compact and careful man who had been Marshal of Caldwell for 3 years and who, in Georgia's observation, was genuinely good at his job. He listened to everything she told him without interrupting, asked 4 precise questions, wrote down the answers, and said he would speak to Dalton that morning. "Will he deny it?" Georgia asked. "Almost certainly," Cable said. "But knowing and proving are different things, and sometimes knowing is enough to make a man careful." She thanked him and went back to the office and waited. Edgar returned the following morning, 1 day earlier than expected. She heard Storm in the street before she saw him, the familiar quick step of the bay gelding on the packed earth of Kishom Avenue, and she was at the window when he rode up and dismounted in a single easy motion, and tied the reins with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times. He had 3 days of trail dust on him, and his hat was pushed back off his forehead, and he looked up at the window and saw her, and the expression on his face was so plainly, simply glad, that she had to press her lips together to keep the emotion off her face. He came inside and she told him everything, directly and clearly. He listened without interruption, which was his way, and when she finished he stood at the window looking out at the street for a moment. "He took the Whitfield file," Edgar said. "Yes, the original survey documents and the buyer's correspondence were in it. Nothing in those documents gives him a legitimate claim," Edgar said. "He's hoping to manufacture one or to use them to interfere with the sale." "That's what I concluded as well," Georgia said. He turned from the window. "I'm going to speak to Cable and then to Dalton directly." "I already spoke to Cable," Georgia said. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something that was not quite amusement and not quite tenderness and perhaps was both at once. "Of course you did," he said. "I manage this office when you are not here," she said, a little crisply. "You managed it better than I would have," he said, and he meant it entirely. She could hear that. He crossed the office to her desk and stood there, and she stood up, and he put his arms around her and held her for a moment, trail dust and all, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt the solid reality of him. "I got your letter in Clearwater," he said quietly into her hair. "I left before sunrise the next day." She pulled back enough to look at his face. He had ridden hard to get back to her, and they both knew it, and it was a love letter written in miles. "The file is gone," she said. "But I copied the critical documents 2 weeks ago as part of the archive update. I have the copies." He looked at her. "You copied them." "I was updating the archive system," she said. "It was a routine procedure." "Georgia, what?" "You are remarkable," he said. She felt the flush rise in her face and did not try to suppress it. "Go wash the trail off you," she said. "Then we can go to Cable together with what we have." He went. She sat down and permitted herself a full 30 seconds of private happiness before she opened the ledger and got back to work. The situation with Dalton resolved itself with the particular unsatisfying completeness that most real-world situations managed. Marshal Cable went to Dalton's ranch, and Dalton denied taking the file. There was no witness and no direct evidence, and the law in 1881 Kansas was a practical and limited thing. But Cable made clear what he knew and what he was watching, and Edgar went himself the following morning and spoke to Dalton with a directness that Georgia was not present for, but that Percy, who had been holding the horses outside, reported later with wide eyes, involved none of the violence that the wide eyes suggested. Edgar had simply laid out exactly what the consequences would be if the Whitfield transaction was interfered with, in clear and unhurried detail, and Dalton had listened and looked at the ground and said nothing. The Whitfield sale concluded without further incident 10 days later, the St. Louis buyer arriving on the stage to sign the documents, and Georgia sat at her desk and witnessed the signatures with a perfectly professional expression, and felt the satisfaction of something completed against resistance like a chord resolving. Dalton was not seen in the office again. October turned into November, and the Kansas sky became enormous and pale, and the air went cold and thin in the mornings with a clarity that Georgia found bracing and beautiful. Marta's boarding house was warm with the big iron stove that occupied the corner of the front parlor, and Georgia had come to love the evenings there, the small domestic world of it, the way the parlor filled with warmth and the smell of whatever Marta was cooking, the sound of conversation from the other boarders drifting through the walls. She was happy. She was aware of being happy in a way that she thought of as adult happiness, not the bright, thoughtless happiness of childhood, but the kind that comes from having chosen something real and finding that the real thing is worth choosing. She was good at her work and she knew it. She had built something genuine in Caldwell, a life with texture and friendship and purpose. She was loved by a man who was worth loving. This last point she had verified with the accumulating evidence of months by every measure she could apply to it. Edgar Rourke was not perfect. He was sometimes impatient when things moved slowly, had a particular blindness to social situations that required subtlety rather than directness, and had the rancher's instinct for understatement that sometimes made him nearly impossible to read when he was troubled about something. But he was honest and fair and kind in the deep structural way that mattered most, the kind that operated when no one was watching and when it cost something. He was a man who kept his word. He was a man who had ridden a day early through November cold because she had sent him a letter saying come back. He took her to supper on a Friday evening in November that was cold enough that she wore her winter cloak, the wool one in dark green, and he had looked at her when she came down Marta's front steps, and his expression had been so plainly, helplessly appreciative that she had laughed out loud. They sat at their usual table at the hotel, and the candles were lit against the early dark, and the room was warm, and outside the wind was beginning to pick up and carry the first real edge of winter, and Edgar was quiet through the first part of supper in a way that she recognized as meaning something was working in him. She let it work and ate her supper and did not press. He said, when the plates were cleared and the coffee came, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. He turned his coffee cup once in his hands, the gesture echoing the hat-turning she had observed in him before, the tell that meant he was reaching for something with his whole self. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I know that's a large thing to say without a great deal of preamble, and I know you had a marriage before that wasn't what it should have been, and I don't want to press on something that might be tender." He stopped. He looked at her. "But I find that I love you, Georgia, and I would like very much for this to be a permanent arrangement." Georgia looked at him across the candle-lit table and felt everything quiet in her, not the quiet of uncertainty but the quiet of a thing arriving exactly when and how and in what form it was supposed to. "Edgar Rourke," she said, "I love you also, and yes, I will marry you." He had been holding very still through her answer, and now something released in him, a breath, the set of his shoulders, the particular careful tension of a man who was braced for the possibility of pain and has found instead something else entirely. The slow, crooked grin came, wider than usual, and she thought she would spend the rest of her life trying to be in the room when that grin appeared. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, the deep blue-green of a Kansas summer sky, and he put it on her finger across the table, and she looked at it for a long moment without speaking because it was exactly right, and she could not have described beforehand what exactly right would look like. "I had it made at the jeweler in Wichita," he said, "when I was through there in October, in case you said yes." "You went to Wichita in October," she said, "on the way to the Beaumont settlement, yes, and you had a ring made." "I had some hope," he said. She looked up from the ring to his face and felt full to the edges of herself. "Some hope," she repeated. "Considerable hope," he admitted. They were married in December of 1881, in the small white church on the eastern edge of Caldwell, on a clear and brilliantly cold morning when the frozen grass on the prairie was white with frost, and the sky above it was that particular winter blue that is like looking into something that has no bottom. Marta Swenson cried openly and without apology. Percy stood up very straight and tried to look solemn and mostly succeeded. Clara Hatch and her husband sat in the front row, and Clara was composed in the way of someone who is composed by considerable effort. Ellen Price wept cheerfully. The ceremony was conducted by the minister, a gentle and earnest man named Reverend Oakes, who had been in Caldwell for 2 years, and who read the words with evident sincerity. Georgia wore her best dress, the dark green wool she had brought from Charleston that had not yet had occasion grand enough to justify wearing, and she had dressed her hair with the help of Marta, and there were small white flowers, dried ones from Marta's garden, tucked along the side of it. When Edgar turned to watch her come down the narrow aisle between the church's few rows of wooden benches, the look on his face was the one she had seen at the creek in August, the one that was entirely unguarded, and she walked toward it with her whole heart. He said "I do" in a voice that was entirely steady, which was how she had expected it to be, and when she said it her voice was equally steady, because she meant it exactly and completely, and meaning a thing fully is steadying. The minister pronounced them married. Edgar kissed her in the cold, clear church, with the December light coming through the high, narrow windows, and Georgia put her hand flat on his chest, and felt his heart beating fast beneath it, and knew, without any remaining uncertainty, that this was the correct and true direction she had been walking toward all along. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was a good one, if cold, and Georgia and Edgar made their life together with the pleasure of 2 capable people who have found a partner worth partnering with. Edgar's small house behind the office became theirs. Georgia had preferences about the running of a household, specific and practical ones, and Edgar respected them with the combination of goodwill and sensible self-interest that suggested he understood that a house run to Georgia's standards was a materially better house. She hung her mother's photograph on the wall of the sitting room, and Edgar hung a map of the Kansas and Indian territories beside it, which Georgia found both practical and characteristic. They built a new routine together, one that combined the working rhythm of the office with the domestic one of the house, and it was a busier life than either of them had led separately, but it was rich with the business of being genuinely known by someone, of having a person who watched and understood and was present with you in the whole of it. Georgia was also, she discovered in February of 1882, expecting a child. She told Edgar on a Sunday evening when they were sitting by the fire in the sitting room, she with her mending and he with the week's correspondence, and the fire was making the particular sound of a good hot fire that has been properly built with seasoned wood, and she set down her mending and said his name, and he looked up from his papers. She told him. She watched his face go through several things very quickly, something like surprise, and then something that she could only describe as a quiet and enormous joy, the kind that doesn't shout but moves through a person from the inside out. He put down the correspondence and came and sat beside her on the settee and took her hands. "Georgia," he said softly. "Yes," she said. He brought her hands up and kissed them, both of them, and pressed his forehead briefly against them, and she leaned her cheek on the top of his head, and they sat like that for a little while in the fire-lit room while outside the winter wind moved over the Kansas prairie. The spring of 1882 came with the particular exuberance of Plain Springs, the sudden surge of green across the grass, The enormous migration of birds through the sky over Caldwell in long wavering formations, the return of the trail drivers and the cattle, and the whole busy season of the brokerage cranking back into motion. Georgia worked at the office through the spring with the pragmatic approach to pregnancy that frontier life more or less required, making adjustments where sensible and ignoring the suggestion from several well-meaning quarters that she should rest more than she was inclined to do. Percy was now, under Georgia's consistent instruction, a young man who could read a contract and cipher accounts and write a legible letter, and he took on more of the running work of the office with a pride in his own competence that Georgia found deeply satisfying. He was also, she had noticed with some amusement, completely devoted to Ellen Price, the schoolteacher, a fact that Ellen was perfectly aware of and responded to with a gentle and encouraging warmth that suggested things were developing at a pace appropriate to their mutual shyness. Edgar expanded the brokerage in the spring, taking on a second broker, a capable young man from Abilene named Henry Torres, whose mother had come north from Mexico when he was a boy, and whose bilingual abilities were useful for dealings with some of the Spanish land grant questions arising in the southern Kansas territory. Henry was 27, quick-minded and meticulous, and Georgia liked him immediately in the particular way she liked people who were very good at what they did. She also, in the spring of 1882, had a letter from her father in Charleston. It was not the first. He had written twice since her marriage, letters that began with something close to reproach and softened by the middle into something closer to anxious concern. She had answered both of them with honesty, telling him about Caldwell and the brokerage and Edgar, about the life she had built, and the tone of his letters had shifted gradually toward the cautious and uncertain register of a man who had made assumptions about what his daughter needed and was beginning to suspect they had been wrong. This third letter was different. It was shorter and less formal than the previous ones. He said he had spoken to an old friend who had been through Kansas the previous year, and who had described Caldwell and the country around it with something like admiration, which her father said he had not expected. He said he thought perhaps he had not given Georgia sufficient credit for knowing her own mind. He said that if this man Rourke was the sort of man she believed him to be, he supposed he would have to trust her judgment on the matter, as she appeared to have been right about a considerable number of things he had been wrong about. It was, for her father, a significant concession. Georgia read it twice and then folded it carefully and put it in the box on the writing desk where she kept important letters, and that evening she showed it to Edgar, who read it quietly and handed it back. "Are you glad?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I didn't think I needed his approval to be glad. But I'm glad to have it anyway." "That seems right," Edgar said, which was the sort of thing he said that landed so perfectly that she could not improve on it. She wrote her father back that week and told him she was expecting a child in October, and told him that if he ever had the inclination to travel west, he was welcome in their house in Caldwell. She told him about Percy and about Henry Torres and about the prairie in spring, the way the grass went from brown to green practically overnight, and the way the sky over it was so large it seemed to belong to a different world from the sky over Charleston. She told him she was happy, in the plain and specific way, describing particular things, because she had found that the plain and specific was more convincing than the general assertion. The summer passed. The brokerage was busy. The cattle drives moved through Caldwell and the town swelled and contracted with the rhythm of the season. Georgia went on working at the office until August and then, at Edgar's careful and only moderately pushy suggestion, moved to a half-day schedule while things continued smoothly under Henry's capable management of the routine work. She spent more time with Marta and Clara and Ellen on the half-days she was home, and she was knitting badly, because Clara said it was a useful skill, and Georgia had decided she would be competent at it by October if it took every quiet afternoon she had. Edgar was, Through the summer and into the early autumn, the particular variety of loving that expressed itself primarily in practical attentiveness, making sure the water barrel was never less than half full, that there was always wood cut, and the fire could be built quickly, that Storm was stabled close enough that he could be saddled in under 5 minutes if needed. He rode out to the ranches less than he might have otherwise and sent Henry in his place on the longer trips, which he mentioned to Georgia once and then did not mention again, as though it was a simple matter of logistics rather than a choice. She knew it was a choice. She let him make it without commentary, but she said something true one evening at supper, looking at him across the table. "You are a very good man, Edgar Rourke." He looked up from his plate and she could see he was slightly taken aback by the directness of it. "Georgia," he said, in the tone of someone who is not sure where to put a compliment. "I mean it simply," she said. "I wanted to say it plainly." He was quiet for a moment. "You deserve a good man," he said then, "and I intend to keep being one." She looked at him and felt the old warmth, full and complete and undiminished. "I know you do," she said. Their son was born on the 2nd of October, 1882, in the bedroom of the house behind the brokerage office, delivered by Clara's husband, Dr. Hatch, with Clara assisting. He came into the world in the early hours of the morning with considerable volume and an abundance of dark hair, and Edgar, who had been in the next room since midnight wearing a path in the floorboards, was allowed in when it was finished, and stood at the bedside looking down at the child in Georgia's arms with an expression that Georgia thought was the most completely vulnerable thing she had ever seen on a human face. "He looks like you," she said, because he did, around the eyes especially. Edgar put one careful finger against the baby's cheek. The baby turned toward it with the absolute animal trust of the newborn, and Edgar made a sound that was not quite a word, and Georgia put her free hand over his where it rested on the bed and held on. They named him James William Rourke, for Edgar's father and Georgia's grandfather, and he was called James from the first day, and was from the earliest weeks of his life the particular kind of child who regards the world with a solemn and apparently effortful interest that made everyone who encountered him feel they were being carefully assessed. Marta said he had his mother's eyes. Edgar said he had his mother's way of taking stock of things. Georgia said she hoped he had his father's steadiness. James was steady, as it turned out. He was a quiet baby and then a quiet and watchful toddler, and Percy, who was almost comically devoted to him from the first time he held him in the brokerage office at 6 weeks old, declared him to be the finest individual in Caldwell, and was not effectively argued out of this position. 1883 arrived and the brokerage continued to grow. Henry Torres had become a genuine partner in the business, and Edgar formalized this in the spring by offering him a share of the firm, which Henry accepted with a dignity that Georgia observed and approved of entirely. Percy, now 21, was taking on more of the active brokerage work and was developing into a genuinely capable businessman, his natural intelligence having been given the tools it had been lacking in his schoolless childhood. Georgia worked at the office 4 mornings a week, with James managed in the mornings by Marta, who had taken to the role of honorary grandmother with entirely characteristic wholeheartedness. Ellen Price had, by January of 1883, become Ellen Percy, the schoolteacher and the cowhand married in the same church where Georgia and Edgar had married, on a spring morning, and Georgia had stood beside Marta and wept in the comfortable way of someone who is not sad at all but whose heart is too full for any other response. The town of Caldwell was changing around them, as all the Kansas cattle towns were changing in those years. The great cattle drives that had defined the Kishom Trail's era were slowing as the railroads pushed further south, and the trail itself was interrupted by the spread of farming settlement across the Indian Territory and the Kansas grasslands. The era of the trail drives would not last forever, and Edgar and Georgia both understood this and had been deliberately building the brokerage toward the kind of land transaction business that would outlast the cattle era, the buying and selling and developing of the Kansas grasslands, as homesteaders and farmers and town builders pushed further and further into the territory. It was in the spring of 1883 that Georgia had an idea that she put to Edgar one evening after James was in his bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. She proposed that the brokerage begin a homestead assistance service. The Homestead Act had been law for over 20 years, and there were families coming into Kansas territory every season, many of them without the legal knowledge or the contacts to file their claims and establish their land rights properly, and many of them had been taken advantage of by land speculators and fraudulent claim sellers who knew the legal gaps in the system. Georgia proposed that Rourke and Torres offer a service specifically for homesteaders at reduced cost to help them file their claims correctly and defend their titles. Edgar listened to the whole of it without interrupting. Then he looked at her. "It's not the most profitable part of the market," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it's the right thing to do, and it will build the kind of reputation that pays over time. And frankly, Edgar, I have seen what happens to families who come here without help and get their land pulled out from under them, and I would rather we be on the right side of that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll talk to Henry," he said. Henry, when Edgar talked to him, was immediately and enthusiastically in favor of it, because he had seen the same thing Georgia had seen, and because his own family's history was not unrelated to the experience of people arriving in an uncertain land without the legal protections they were owed. The Homestead Service was announced in the spring of 1883 and was immediately in demand. Within 6 months, Georgia was managing it as a distinct part of the firm's work, keeping its own ledger and correspondence system, and by the end of that year, they had assisted 43 families in establishing clear legal title to their homestead claims. Several of those families had been facing fraudulent prior claims manufactured by speculators, and Edgar and Henry had gone to the county land office and in 2 cases to the federal land office in Topeka to fight for them. Georgia had also sent letters on behalf of several families to sympathetic members of Congress. She had a gift for this kind of correspondence, the precise and well-documented argument delivered in language clear enough to be unmissable and formal enough to be taken seriously. 3 of these letters had generated responses. One had generated an inquiry. She did not know if the inquiry would lead to anything, but she believed in the accumulative weight of documented truth, and she kept writing. It was in late 1883 that Georgia received a long letter from her father. He had been ill over the summer, he said, nothing life-threatening but the kind of illness that makes a man take stock. And in the taking of stock, he had been thinking about his daughter in Kansas and what she had built there, and what he had done, and not done in the years that her life was in his charge. The letter was not perfectly graceful, but it was sincere, and sincerity had always moved Georgia more than grace when she had to choose between them. He asked if he might come and visit in the spring. Georgia wrote back the same day and said yes, absolutely, and told him about James, who was now walking with tremendous determination and purpose, and who had recently, at 14 months old, climbed the first 3 steps of the staircase entirely on his own in a moment that had required both Edgar and Georgia to suppress competing impulses to cheer and to intercept. She wrote about the brokerage and the homestead service, and the way Caldwell looked in autumn, the cottonwoods along Bluff Creek going yellow and orange against the pale sky. Her father came in the spring of 1884. He was older than she expected, the illness having taken something from him, and smaller somehow than the figure who occupied her memory. But his eyes were as sharp as ever, and he stood on the front step of the small house behind the brokerage, and looked at everything with the careful assessment she had always associated with him, and which she recognized, looking at it now, in herself. James, who was a year and a half and in the most intensive period of his appraisal of the world, regarded his grandfather with the full weight of his solemn brown eyes for approximately 30 seconds, and then made his decision and reached up and grabbed the older man's trouser leg with both fists and held on, which made her father laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and something tight in Georgia's chest let go. Edgar and her father sat together after supper on the first evening, the two of them, while Georgia put James to bed and then lingered longer than strictly necessary at the task so they could have the time without her. When she came back down, they were both still at the table, and there was the empty coffee pot between them, and they were talking quietly about Kansas land law, which was not what she had expected, but which, she thought, was exactly how it would go between two men who expressed care through the practical. Before her father left after his 2-week visit, he stood on the front step with his bag and shook Edgar's hand, and then he turned to Georgia and held her face in his hands for a moment in a gesture that was so like what Edgar had done on the night he kissed her at Marta's boarding house that her breath caught. "You were right," he said quietly, "about all of it." She put her arms around him and held on. The summer of 1884 was a good one. The brokerage was doing well. James was too, and conducting his exploration of the world with the systematic enthusiasm of someone who is discovering that it is very large and extremely interesting. Edgar had taken to bringing him to the office on slow mornings, where James sat under the desk with a set of wooden blocks that Percy had made for him, and built structures with a focused intensity that Edgar said, with the dry humor Georgia loved, was indistinguishable from his own approach to a difficult land transaction. Percy and Ellen were expecting their first child in the fall, and the whole town seemed to have a stake in it, which was the nature of small communities where the arrivals and departures of people were known and felt. Georgia was quietly preparing a set of knitted things, now considerably better than the badly knitted items of 1882, and Clara Hatch was conducting the medical preparations with her usual composed efficiency. On an August evening, the sun setting big and orange over the western prairie and James asleep, and the house quiet, Georgia and Edgar sat on the small porch at the back of the house that looked out over the open land, and she was leaning against his shoulder and his arm was around her, and neither of them was saying anything. The prairie in the August evening was the color of an old gold coin, the grass moving in a slow, warm wind that came from the south and carried the smell of summer in it, dry and sweet and wide, and the sky above it was going from deep blue at the top to orange at the horizon, and the first star was appearing at the eastern edge, and the whole of it was so beautiful it was almost painful to look at. Georgia thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell 3 years ago with a leather trunk and a hat box and $20, and a door swinging open behind her, and no clear idea of what was in front. She thought about the office window and the man behind the cluttered desk. She thought about the creek in August and the turquoise ring on her finger. She thought about James sleeping upstairs with his dark hair against the pillow. "Edgar," she said. He said, "Are you happy?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking about it properly rather than deflecting it with a quick answer. She appreciated that about him consistently and always. "Yes," he said, with the plain and complete conviction of a man who means exactly what he says. "Considerably." She turned her face up to look at him, and he looked down at her, and the amber in his eyes was warm in the sunset light, and she thought she had been looking at those eyes for 3 years, and she intended to keep looking at them for the rest of her life. "Good," she said. "Me too." He kissed her forehead, and she turned her face back to the prairie. They sat there while the sun went fully down, and the stars came out over Kansas in their enormous numbers, the kind of sky you could only see from flat open land, and the warm wind moved through the grass, and somewhere in the town, a piano was playing something she could not quite identify, just the melody drifting out over the evening air, and Georgia was whole and complete in a way that she understood now took a particular kind of courage to arrive at, not the courage of the dramatic gesture, but the daily, ordinary, determined courage of someone who chooses their own direction and walks. She was still walking. She was walking with her hand in Edgar Rourke's hand and their son asleep in the house behind them and the whole immense sky above them. And it was exactly what she had come 3 days by stage and train to find, not knowing it was this specifically, but knowing it was something real, and real was what she had found. In the spring of 1885, their second child was born, a son again, which delighted James considerably, as he had opinions about the matter that had been previously expressed in the direct and unambiguous manner of a 3-year-old. They named this second boy Robert, for no ancestor in particular, but because Edgar said he looked like a Robert and Georgia agreed that he did. And he proved this by being from his earliest days a cheerful and voluble individual in strong contrast to his contemplative older brother, which Georgia observed with the enjoyment of someone who had known from the beginning that two people who were as different as she and Edgar would produce interesting variations. Percy and Ellen had their daughter in October of 1884, a red-haired girl named Louise, and Percy, the former cowhand who had once told Georgia he had no head for figures, was now a full partner in the brokerage, and a man Georgia was genuinely proud of in the particular way of someone who has watched another person discover what they were capable of. Henry Torres had married in 1884 as well, a woman named Rosario who had come up from the New Mexico territory with her brother, a land surveyor, and who was teaching Henry's own mother to read English, which Henry reported with a quiet and enormous pride. Rosario and Georgia became friends with the immediacy of two women who are both very direct and very capable, and find this a relief in each other. The homestead assistance work continued and grew. In 1885, the firm had assisted over 100 families in establishing their land claims, and 2 of the cases Georgia had sent letters about had generated federal-level attention to certain fraudulent speculator practices in the Kansas territory. She could not know with certainty how much her letters had contributed to this, but she knew the timing, and she knew the documentation she had sent, and she thought it was not nothing. Life in Caldwell in those years was not without its difficulties, its losses, its moments of fracture that required mending. Marta Swenson had a hard winter in 1885 with her health, and Georgia spent many evenings with her, sitting at her bedside reading aloud or simply present in the way that matters when someone is fragile. Marta recovered and was back on her feet with full Swedish stubbornness by March, and Georgia brought James and Robert to see her, and she held both of them with the comprehensive warmth of a woman who was, in every way that counted, their grandmother. The town of Caldwell was changing. The cattle drives were fewer now, the railroad having pushed further south. Some of the establishments that had thrived on trail drive money were adapting or closing. The Silver Star Saloon had become a general merchant's. The livery was doing a different kind of business with the farming families who were now the predominant population coming through. The wildness of the early cattle era was settling into something more sustained and less dramatic, but no less real, the ordinary project of people building lives in a new place. Edgar and Georgia's house had grown with them. They had added 2 rooms in 1884, one for the boys to share eventually, and one that Georgia used as a proper study, with the writing desk from Marta's boarding house that Marta had insisted she take when she moved out, and shelves that Edgar had built along one wall and that held, by 1885, a respectable number of books accumulated through the careful mail orders that were one of Georgia's consistent expenditures. On a November evening in 1885, Georgia was at her desk in the study, working on a brief for a homestead claim dispute that was going before the county land commissioner the following week, and the lamp was lit against the early dark, and the fire was built well, and from down the hall she could hear Edgar reading to James and Robert, his steady, unhurried voice carrying through the quiet of the house, and James asking a question in his serious, precise way, and Robert interjecting something that made Edgar laugh, and the lamp cast warm light on the papers in front of her, and the photograph of her mother on the corner of the desk, and the turquoise ring on her left hand. She had a good brief. She was going to win this land claim. The family in question, A couple named Haverson with 4 children who had come from Minnesota the previous spring had a completely legitimate homestead right that had been challenged by a speculator who had manufactured a prior claim with forged dates on a surveyor's document. And Georgia had found the forgery by comparing the handwriting and the date notation to the same surveyor's other work from the same period, and they did not match in 3 specific points that she had documented carefully, and which she intended to present to the land commissioner in the calm and precise voice she used when she was absolutely certain she was right. The Haversons were going to keep their land. She put her pen down for a moment and listened to Edgar's voice reading down the hall, and James's question and Robert's interjection, and she thought about the particular quality of a life that is full in the right ways, not without difficulty or complexity or the ordinary weight of loss and effort, but full with the things that matter, work that is worth doing, people who are known and loved, a place that is genuinely home. The days had a shape now. They had the brokerage in the morning and the supper table in the evening, and the boys growing and learning and becoming themselves. They had the prairie and the enormous sky, and the seasons that came through Kansas with the dramatic fullness of a country that is not modest about what it is. They had the ongoing conversation of 2 people who had chosen each other for the right reasons and kept finding reasons to confirm the choice. Georgia picked up her pen and wrote the final argument of her brief in the clear and precise hand that the land commissioner would find impossible to dismiss, and the fire burned well in the fireplace, and from down the hall Edgar's voice continued reading, steady and warm, and outside the November wind moved over Caldwell, Kansas, carrying the first cold breath of the winter to come, and inside the house was warm and full and entirely, irrevocably hers. She finished the brief and blotted it and set it on the corner of the desk for the morning. She put out the lamp and went down the hall to where Edgar had gotten to the end of the chapter and was closing the book with James already half asleep against his shoulder and Robert deeply, thoroughly asleep on his other side, both boys in their night clothes and the lamp low on the bedside table casting soft gold over all of it. Edgar looked up at her in the doorway, and she looked back at him, and between them was everything they had built and made and chosen and lived, the years of it, and the years still ahead of it, and his amber eyes in the low light were warm and quiet and entirely, irreversibly hers. She came and sat beside him on the edge of the narrow bed, and he moved his arm to make room for her, and she leaned into him, her shoulder against his, the weight of a day completed and a life well made settling around them both. "Good brief?" he asked quietly so as not to wake the boys. "The best I've written," she said. "We're going to win." He turned and kissed her temple, and she felt it down to her bones. "Of course you are," he said. "You always do." She looked at her sons sleeping, at the warm room, at the life that had been made of an October afternoon in a cluttered office, and a bed on herself, and a direction chosen and walked, and she felt the full and certain knowledge of having arrived at the exact right place. James murmured something in his sleep, something that might have been a question or the beginning of a dream, and Georgia reached out and smoothed the dark hair from his forehead with the particular tenderness of a mother, which was still sometimes surprising to her, how bottomless it was, how it had its own logic entirely. Robert slept on, undisturbed. Edgar breathed slowly beside her, and his hand found hers in the small space between them and held it, as naturally as breathing. Outside, the Kansas winter was making its way across the prairie toward Caldwell, and inside the house behind the brokerage on Kisham Avenue, everything was warm and complete and entirely at peace. And Georgia Harper, who had stepped off a stagecoach with $20 and an open door behind her, who had walked into a cluttered office and changed 2 lives in the span of an afternoon, who had loved and been loved in return with the full and irreversible weight of the real thing, closed her eyes in the warmth and the quiet and let herself rest,